In March 2020, as the Western world, including, depressingly, the UK, rushed to ape totalitarian China and lock its citizens indoors, I felt physically sick. Now, GBNews didn't exist then, but on my talk radio drive time show that history-making month, I implored the British government to make any restrictions on our civil liberties voluntary. And I signed up to the theory espoused by the Chief Scientific Officer Patrick Vallance that harsh lockdowns would only delay the inevitable and lead to a monumental peak in the winter of 2020 into 2021, which sadly did end up happening.
All of the evidence from previous epidemics suggests that when you do that and then you release it, it all comes back again. So the other part of this is to make sure that we don't end up with a sudden peak again in the winter, which is even larger, which causes even more problems. So we want to suppress it, not get rid of it completely, which you can't do anyway, not suppress it so we get the second peak, and also allow enough of us who are going to get mild illness to become immune to this, to help with the sort of whole population response, which would protect everybody.
So that's Vallance, pretty much explaining the strategy later set out by the Great Barrington Declaration, an action plan of which I am a proud signatory and whose co-author will be here later. But under international pressure, Vallance and Chris Whitty buckled. Then so too did Boris, driven by frankly outrageously incorrect modelling by Professor Pantsdown Neil Ferguson, who delivered the infamous Report 9 on March the 16th, 2020. It warned of 500,000 total deaths over 2 years based on the ludicrous assumption that none of us would naturally change our behaviour without legal restrictions to adjust to a pandemic. But the die was cast. Just a week later, the Prime Minister would shut down the entire country for the first of 3 devastating lockdowns. He asked us for 3 weeks to flatten the curve, and I was prepared to follow the advice for less than a month in order for the NHS to get its act together. But as brave commentators like Toby Young, who'll be here later too, correctly predicted, a government in crisis would never be prepared to give up the powers we so easily handed them. Powers to control our daily movements, our freedoms, who we could see, where we could go, whether we could even use the NHS to be checked up for a potentially cancerous lump, whether we could visit a suicidal family member or an abused young child. The list goes on. As I said at the time, I was convinced the COVID cure was becoming far worse than the virus itself. And the rest, 23 months on, is history. Or is it? I say it must not be. Scientific study after study proves that lockdown skeptics like me were right. The damage wrought on society has been so great. But what's more, probably only prevented a tiny number of fatalities. Just this month, a paper whose authors hailed from institutions including the Johns Hopkins University found lockdowns reduced deaths by only 0.2%. And as we now know for certain, lockdown has contributed to thousands and thousands of excess deaths itself. That's why tonight I'm launching the Lockdown Inquiry. Over the next weeks and months on this show, the world's top experts, epidemiologists, politicians, commentators and ordinary folk have had their lives destroyed by draconian lockdown policies will give evidence. I fear the official COVID inquiry will ignore the damage of the lockdown policy and the nudge unit propaganda which has left millions terrified. The official narrative from the establishment is set. If Boris had locked the country down 2 weeks earlier and sealed the borders to turn the UK into a New Zealand-style hermit kingdom, we would have avoided the worst of COVID and all would have been fine and dandy. That narrative is a delusional fantasy. The government and SAGE were told in July 2020 in a report drawn up by civil servants at the Department of Health, the Office for National Statistics and the Home Office that as many as 200,000 people could end up being killed by lockdowns from the impact of the measures in protecting the NHS in the medium to long term as a result of missed cancer diagnoses, cancelled operations and the health impacts of a recession. And those stats are alarmingly starting to come true. So, lockdown killed 21,000 people in the first 8 weeks of the pandemic. That's according to analysis from the University of Sheffield. There were 4,785 more heart deaths between the start of the first national lockdown in March 2020 to October 2020. There are an extra 1,400 alcohol deaths in 2020, not to mention the cancer crisis that would kill tens of thousands. But these are all human tragedies too. There's Azra Hussein, a mother of 4, suffering from bipolar, who committed suicide following a missed treatment and virtual appointment necessity. There's Sergeant Paul Hills, a veteran suffering from mental health problems, who took his own life after his care was moved to virtual appointments. There's Ruth Jones, an elderly lady who died following a fall in isolation at a care home. There's Angela Winter, who took her own life on the streets after she and her husband Michael were made homeless during lockdown. And there's Anthony Williamson, who died on his birthday at sea with Coast Guard cover reduced because of the pandemic. Now, in my opinion, much of the blame for how we got here lies with the British broadcast media, the BBC, ITV News, Good Morning Britain, Sky News and Channel 4 News. They have never questioned the efficacy of lockdown, only demanded harder lockdown restrictions on their viewers' lives.
How likely is it, how prepared are you to introduce criminal sanctions if necessary?
Do you have any regrets about not taking more draconian measures sooner?
When will we see wider enforcement to shut down London properly? Wouldn't you save more lives if you did keep all non-essential workers at home?
Is it the government's view that people need to be willing to follow these restrictions for as long as 6 months, if that's what it takes?
You just said that you are prepared to introduce national measures if the evidence requires it. Have you 3 agreed a threshold at which you will have to introduce national measures?
We know that lockdown suppressed the virus. How can we be confident that these much lesser measures will do the same job of protecting us?
Prime Minister, you've said many times you want to avoid another national lockdown. Are you just delaying the inevitable?
This looks like we're getting to a point where significantly tougher restrictions are needed, if not nationally, then at least in vast parts of the country. The lesson of the first spike was the longer you wait, the worse it gets, and the more that costs the economy. So why not act more draconianly today?
Northern Ireland and Wales have both now announced what they're calling a fire break, a short period of severe restrictions. Do you think that now should be the approach for England as well?
Do you accept that realistically we are going to have to be living with some sort of restrictions over December and into the new year? Should we all still prepare for restrictions to run through to April?
Given the rapid rise in cases we're seeing in some areas of the country, should you be rethinking plans to relax the rules?
Wouldn't it now be safer, clearer and perhaps braver to ditch the plans to relax the rules over Christmas?
What is the argument for not taking mild suppressive measures now?
When do you think extra restrictions should be imposed?
Now is the moment when people are going to parties, they're going to the pub. Why aren't you more explicitly discouraging them?
If now isn't the time for extra restrictions, when will be?
Proof, as if we needed it, that the British broadcast media has campaigned for lockdowns and restrictions on your lives. So this inquiry will rightly examine the media as we go too. Rest assured, the lockdown zealots, like former Health Secretary Matt Hancock, have also been invited to give evidence because of GBNews. We always hear from both sides of the argument. So the lockdown inquiry begins today, and of course I want our amazing army of viewers to be a part of it. I've had hundreds of messages over the weekend from you, reminding me to look into many shameful aspects of the lockdown, from the hell inflicted on Leicester, to the political approach of Nicola Sturgeon, to the unimaginable cruelty of the funeral industry during the COVID era, where relatives were banned from seeing their loved ones who had passed on. We'll be covering all of this as the inquiry continues over the next weeks and months, so I would like to hear your stories too. You know where to find me, at Dan Wootton on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, or dan@gbnews.uk on email. Lockdowns don't work, they never did, and they must never happen again.